All right. So, the assignment is to talk about Eyes on the Prize and what do we learn in these two chapters. So let's talk about Eyes on the Prize. So, part one. Part one was about civil rights, how they fought for in every aspect of life to gain more freedom. I mean, they were oppressed. To have less oppression, that they fought for that in every aspect of life. The South did not care about Supreme Court rulings. So I mean that had a big effect on civil rights because since the South wasn't following the laws, a lot of the citizens could get away with being racist and stuff, and they could have segregation like they did in the South because they didn't follow the Supreme Court's ruling. African Americans were beat for no reason, and which would occur in death, which was not right at all, which was another thing that had a big impact on why the civil rights movement was as important as it was and so prominent. They wanted to stop this violence, and the deaths were definitely a big impact on the civil rights movement. By law and customs, blacks were servants, laborers, tenant farmers. Their conditions for schools and public places, they had separate poor schools, separate water fountains, separate everything, waiting rooms, everything was different, and the quality wasn't even to par, they weren't even made equal. And so they just wanted, if you're at least gonna have us in two different rooms, they just wanted to everything to be equal. Why should we have less just because of the color of our skin? Why can't we just all be the same? That was another reason that the civil rights movement was so big and the impact that those actions had on it. It was because they just wanted to be treated equal. Also, the separate rules, if they were broken, beatings and incurred in death. World War II, this was a big one that had a big impact on the civil rights movement, since this kind of propelled it to be something big and realistic in their mind, because this was the first time that they saw opportunities, and they saw blacks reaching new power positions that they haven't reached before, being leaders in the military, getting new desk jobs in the military. They saw an increase in pay, it was an advancement for them, and they saw this, and this had a big impact, really pushed them to want to go further and get more freedom so they could advance as well and get equality. Another thing that we learned about in part one of Eyes on the Prize was about Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a young black man. He wasn't from the South, and this had a big effect on the civil rights movement because he was, quote unquote, talking fresh to a white woman, and he was brutally beat and murdered for this by the dude's girlfriend or wife. And they beat him so bad that it was disturbing. Why did they do this? Why'd they beat him so bad? And this caused Emmett Till's mom to actually host a open casket memorial for him, so the world could see what they did to her baby. And that had a big impact on the civil rights movement, because I think it made people see that this isn't right. Why is this kid being so badly beaten like this because he was just talking to a woman? He wasn't even from the South, so he didn't know what he was doing really. He didn't know. He thought he was just being normal since he was originally from Chicago and he was down in the South visiting his aunt. Another thing that we learned about in Eyes on the Prize, part 1 and 2, was the bus boycott in Montgomery. This is a big impact since blacks could be forced to get up out of their seats by other white passengers. They didn't have equal opportunity on the bus. Whites had priority over them, and if they refused, they would be arrested if they didn't give up their seat. And so they did a bus boycott to get equality on this, and this had a big impact since the bus companies weren't making as much money. They had to compromise and give them the equality that they wanted with this. And during this, like, they created their own transportation system, like their own public transportation system, to make this a possibility to do as well. Schools in the South were still segregated and paid little attention to the Supreme Court's rulings. Lucy was the first African-American student admitted to an all-white college, and riots broke out. But this was a big step in civil rights, because this was the first time that we were seeing integration in schools. And, in the South. It was a small step, but it was still a big step at the same time. I mean, any progress forward was a good thing, because at the end of the day, they were making more progress and going farther. Little Rock was another thing that it touched on. Little Rock made plans to desegregate slowly. It was the first city in the South, like in Missouri, to do this. 1957, 5 African-American teens actually started to attend Central High, and this was the start of the desegregation slowly and integration in schools. Riots occurred outside, so the National Guard actually had to be called in to escort students to class and to school to make sure they got safely. And Ernest was the first black student of the Little Rock 5 to graduate from Central High. Also, we learned about how Ole Miss was also being threatened to be shut down if they didn't admit James Meredith into the school.